Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date, a series of programs that we've been doing as a way to help you through the lockdown, to be able to talk about issues that people are worrying about, concerned about. We're doing this in the lockdown in order so that we can just have a more meaningful existence in this particular difficult time. And today it's particularly good that I'm welcoming Wandile Sihlobo, who's a very well-known agricultural economist. And perhaps I should start off. Thank you very much for doing this, Wandile. I appreciate the fact that people have got lots of other things to do, strange as it may seem, even during this lockdown period. But can I ask you right up front, what is your reading of the economy as we into this episode? I suppose let me start off by asking you about the food supply. Do we have anything to worry about?
Now, thanks for having me on, Judge. I think firstly, on the economy side, we are dealing here with the pandemic moving target. The numbers are getting bad day by day. If you look at what the Reserve Bank and IMF and many people in the market are saying, we are definitely looking at least at a more than 6% contraction. That's where the numbers are saying it as far as the economic activity in the country. And obviously that has implications on the job. So on a macroeconomic side, we're not in good standing. But on a food side, though, which is where I spend a lot of time thinking about, we are, at least as South Africa, in a good place. And I think that we are fortunate because even as this virus is coming to the world, it's actually coming to us in a year where we are even having bumper harvest of many of our crops. So we are food secure at a national level, at least for the next 12 months.
So in other words, if we can get out of this COVID over the next 12 months, which one would presumably hope we'll be in serious trouble if we can't, but if we can, you're saying that effectively from the point of view of food, South Africa is actually in fairly good shape.
Yeah, I think on that side, Judge, we are fairly in good shape. But obviously, that's speaking on a national level, and the prices also are pretty much at affordable level if you look at food prices. But I might say, though, there is a vulnerable section of our community because while food might be there and be at relatively affordable prices, but if there is no work, we are in the lockdown, the virus continues for some time, people are out of work, and if there is no levels of income are down, that on its own gets then to influence the issue where we discuss about household food security, which is why I think the recent inventions by the government of all of the food parcels somewhat bring a bit of a relief because I was worried a lot about people's ability to access the food.
Well, let me probe you on that a bit because it's very interesting. One thing that made Amartya Sen very famous was the idea that he had was that when you have a famine, it's not a lack of food, it's the distribution problems that essentially create the famine in the country rather than the actual production of food. And in a sense, if I could get I'm not sure if it's the numerator or the denominator, probably the denominator, meaning there's enough food around. Question is whether that you and I can waddle off to our grocery stores and get plenty of food. But for millions of South Africans, that's become more difficult. Now, what worries me there is when I hear about things like 250,000 food parcels being delivered, etc. That seems awfully little. What I'm saying,
indeed.
Yeah. I suppose, let me just ask this and I'll shut up. What I suppose I'm really asking is, are we managing to distribute sufficient food to those most in need? And if not, why not?
I think, Judge, we will be able to judge it over time if we are distributing sufficient parcels. Because we know now that there's a number of food parcels that has been passed, but also there are food vouchers that are continuously being issued. And I think then one would be able to say in a month's time, to be able to evaluate that and then be able to see if we have really made progress. But certainly, to the point that we are raising, I think it's an important one in a sense that if you were to look at South Africa, we have at least roughly 10 million South Africans that are not working, are unemployed. And now in periods like this, some of those maybe they might have been surviving on some short-term activity that would perhaps maybe appear now and then in society. And now with most businesses closed, those incomes are pretty much eroded. So one can only imagine the pain that do exist in some of these communities. But I think the measures that are beginning to be put in place might assist, but effectiveness of those, as well as a scale at which maybe we could be able to, is one thing that we are continuously monitoring. And then the other thing that has been encouraging from my side is also watching from those that are on the food production side, starting now to have some private conversation of saying, where can they donate and how should those instruments actually work? And even in some of the businesses like our side, those are some of the things that we are thinking about. But the point you have raised is certainly important, and it's the one that we need to all make sure that at least people do have access to food.
You see, I mean, I love the idea of donations, and I think that, as has been indicated in a number of programs we've done over the last while, crises bring out the best in South Africans. It's when normality takes place that we say terrible. And I don't want to disparage the donations of the gratuities at all. Very, very important. But in a way, this is the responsibility of the state to ensure that people, if we're producing enough food, then the state has got to be responsible for ensuring that that food goes to the right mouths, if I can put it that way. And so I suppose, let me ask you this, in the urban areas, is it a case, like if you're living in the townships, is it a case just of, if I had enough cash, I would be able to access food?
Yeah, Judge, I would push back a little bit slightly on the first point you have raised.
Okay, yeah, please do.
Because yes, the food is produced. Yes, South Africa has a sufficient amount of food. You think, for example, of maize. We now saying from May this year, going into April next year, we will have roughly 2.5 million tons of maize, which we will put in export markets, nearly double what we exported in the previous year. But the problem where it comes about, not the problem, but the structure of the economy per se, is that all of that food is produced by private citizens. So the government doesn't really have the means of ensuring whether then that food reaches South Africans or not, because those private citizens will look for places at which they will be better rewarded for their efforts. But in that process of doing that, at least they first consider what's going on in South Africa. And I do think, though, that perhaps the discussions, maybe this is something that we can accelerate even after COVID-19, is an issue of saying, how do we make sure that we get as many people as we can in the labor market? We'll get the people working so that they can have the income component. Because the challenge which we tend to suffer with is more of a social question rather than a food security question. Because the issue is about incomes, not about the availability and the supplies of that.
Yeah, so okay, I take the point, and I take the point that, so what I suppose I'm asking is that if you are living in Khayelitsha or Alexandra or any of the multitude of townships around the country, if, for example, the government or through the UIF fund or through other grants that the government is giving, if you got your check, just call it 1,500 rand for the moment, you would be able to go somewhere in that area and you would find that you could purchase sufficient food to keep your family from being hungry.
Absolutely. That's what now is the case. 2 days after the regulation of the lockdown, when the lockdown started last month, that chain had been broken. The regulation came in a bit of a more ambiguous way, which was able to push some of the people that are in the food value chain, particularly informal traders. They were prohibited for quite some time, but I think now we've gotten the cycle working well again. So regardless of where you are, if you go to your typical markets to source some of the agricultural food products, I'm certain that in most areas of the country, you'll be able to find those supplies. And at least on the production side, that's what we have seen also in the data and of how much of our produce is going through the normal channel. The only areas, obviously, where we've seen a bit of a decline is the supply that will go to the restaurant markets. But that supply of the restaurant markets is not as big as the United States, whereby in the US, roughly 20% of what is consumed in the country goes to the restaurant market. Now, with restaurant closed, you see farmers throwing away milk and food and not really finding markets. We're not there.
Yeah, I mean, and the strange thing is they are worried about their food supply chain, unlike us. Of course, there, I mean, apart from their good restaurants, I mean, most Americans, if you look at them, or so many of them, seem to have about 5 hamburgers and 6 packets of chips a day. So that obviously is a problem now because you can't go to the restaurants to get that. But would you say that, I mean, we now are allowed to have the informal sector producing food? Was it a mistake, as it were, not to allow for food vendors to be in the townships where you could actually go off, a family could go and, there would be food cooked and they'd pay for it and then they'd have their food? Was that a mistake to have prohibited that?
Yeah, I think that was a big mistake, and I would say that perhaps maybe the lawmakers at the time, they were clouded with many things that they were working on, and they didn't really realize the intricacies of the South African food value chain. As you have seen that over the past few weeks, there's been continuously some improvements that have been made, but certainly that was a mistake. It's the same though, Judge, with even the new regulation the past few weeks, whereby you were told that if you're living in the urban areas, you could be able to order some certain foods and be delivered to you. But at the same time, certain food parcels can be allowed whereby you go and pick up your own food, or perhaps maybe warm foods being sold in a restaurant, because those things on their own, they tend to introduce a certain dynamics of saying those who have the means and the capital can be able to order their food to come to them. But now, if I'm not as fortunate as other South Africans, I cannot be able to enjoy those privileges. And I think that those are some of the things that will need to be fine-tuned as we go through various levels of this lockdown.
I accept readily that one of the great dangers about this lockdown is that it discriminates against poor people who happen to, 99% of them happen to be black, and that in a sense, we're seeing reproductions, thanks to apartheid spatial geography, of precisely all the awfulness that occurred, which we thought was something that we were supposed to have redressed. I accept that readily, and I take the point. It was just that I was anxious that, to some extent, I mean, the government's attitude was, well, if you have all sorts of food vendors in the townships, then lots of people crowd there and you can't have the social distancing. So I suppose that one of the problems we're facing with all of this is how we balance these questions.
And I think this is where then the challenge is at. Because for me, perhaps more of the intervention should come about enhancing the health interventions that we would have in those communities, rather than saying we're shutting down completely certain activities because of these dangers. Perhaps maybe we should think of saying, how do we improve the hygiene conditions of those areas? And I do feel the pain for those that are making policy, because there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of information that is coming at them, and they need to make this decision at a real time. And then there is room there for error, and there is room for lack of reflection, maybe in some of the things. But I do think that that is why we have a society to continuously put out some of the information that could assist to shine light in some of the blind spots that we're making. But I do think, though, Judge, long term, one of the things that we will need to be thinking about is generally the spatial development of South Africa. Take the question and link it back to land reform, because this is one of the things that is showing, for example, in the urban areas. You think of Alexandra. It's very difficult to do social distancing and all of these other things that maybe people that are on the other side of the road might be able to do in that area. So we need to think critically on a long term when we think about some of the new housing developments and the land reform linked developments that will actually be made post-COVID-19.
I want to talk to you about that. I just want to ask one other question, and then let's get on to the land reform. I'm delighted you raised that, because I've concentrated my questions to you about the urban areas, the townships. Do I take it that the rural areas are exactly the same, that there is food there? Again, it's a question of people having access to money to purchase the food.
Yeah, in the rural areas also, it's pretty much in the same line. But I do think the additional incomes that have been added up on the social grants will make some meaningful difference in those areas. If I think of my community, for example, in the Transkei, that social, those grants and those old pension funds that come in, they make a notable improvement in people's living standards there. So I think that they will relatively be in a better place. And also the fact that the agricultural activity in the rural communities of South Africa has also been relatively better. It's been a good year. So they do have a little bit of some food supplies. But continuously evaluating and continuously checking all of our numbers and all of our linkages of the food, if it reaches the people, it will be an important thing. And good folks at Stats SA are doing that and publishing up these numbers on a weekly basis so that we have a micro view of what's happening in every community as far as essential products in South Africa.
So let me get on to land reform, Wandile, and you've held some very responsible positions and you're a serious agricultural economist. So if you were asked if this wasn't me sitting at the other end of my computer, but it was the president, and we were moving out of COVID-19, and the president phoned you and he said, Wandile, I want some advice. What would be the 2 or 3 things I should do in relation to land reform over the short-term period? What would you advise him?
I think, Judge, one of the things we will need to think about as we come out of COVID-19 is to say, how can we reconstruct South Africa? And that reconstruction period is going to be requiring investments. So any policy or any ideas that one thinks about on land reform, they need to be cognizant of that we're going to be coming up here with a large debt. We need investments to get things going. Then this means that any questions that is related to expropriations without compensation and all of those things, you need to take those away from the table to be able to attract capital to come in and ensure that you do have solid property rights. And I say that in a sense that if one speaks, for example, with colleagues at the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, and Land Reform, they do talk about numbers somewhere at a range about 9 million hectares or so of land that the government might be having access to, or it's in their books. So that's where I suggest that the president starts on, to say, look at that 9 million hectares that is available, see where it is, and then see what agricultural activity can be done there, which will be labor intensive and also high value products. And then let's focus our energies, at least in the medium term, to establishing those areas. And further to that, there will need to be a serious conversation with the guys that are sitting in communities like mine, in the Transkei, in the former homelands, to say, okay, we do have all of this access to land, but how do we make sure that this time around, we not continue with the same pace that we have been into over the past few decades, and we haven't seen any excitement in as far as economic activity, but how do we bring the economic activity there? How do we make those areas to attract investments? And I think those are the areas at which we need to start on, and the president, in as far as rural economic development and agriculture, might have to start it.
So listening to you, it seems to me that you're talking about the 9 million hectares, you're talking about people who've got land and how do we make it economically attractive for investment. That seems to me, to some extent, that the debate we've had about Section 25 of the Constitution has almost been a red herring, because we should have been doing this anyway.
We should have been doing this in any way, because my sense, though, and I mean, one might see this also even on the writings that we have put out, is that, yes, it's important that we discuss the historic perspective of how the land dynamics in South Africa have been. But at the same time, we shouldn't use that to deflect from some of the other things that we're having. Because I would say, for me, let's look at what we have, the supply of land that is available. Get that to be fully productive or be in the hands of other people that can make productive use of it. Then when this continues to be further demand from that, then you look at what instruments do you have in your toolbox to make sure that at least more and more people get to participate in the sector. But it cannot be that you still have some bit of a supply of land, but you want to keep accumulating. I think that there needs to be some bit of some balancing act on that. And the legal view, for example, that we get from some of our colleagues, a guy by the name Advocate Tembeka Nzukaitobi, he's of the view that he changes on the constitution side. And I do tend to lean in on his side when one looks at this on a legal perspective. But economically, all we need is investments in South African agriculture, and anything that is somewhat pushing that away is not very helpful at this point.
So when I link your discussion earlier, when you spoke right at the beginning of our discussion about the economy and about the difficulties that the economy is going to face coming out of COVID-19, the fact that we may have between 4, 5, 6, 7, who knows, percent decline in GDP, certainly, no doubt about it, less money to play with, because we would have spent a huge amount in what I don't think is a stimulus, but a stabilization package over this period. What effect is that going to have on land reform? We may be able to have the land to distribute. Will we be able to provide smaller farmers with the resources to get them up and running and the training to get them up and running? I don't know if they need that to basically make a go of these matters.
Yeah, I think on that, at least they are relatively in good position. I mean, the departments themselves, they've just recently availed about 1.2 billion rands as a bit of support to agriculture at this point. And I think that money perhaps maybe might have to be deferred a little bit and be spent largely around about July, August, as we go towards the next season. So I'm not as worried a lot on that context. And also, in as long as we can ensure that security of property rights in South Africa prevails, there's not a lot of some interventions on the market policies that guides agricultural markets. I think we will continue to be able to go well in the sector. And Judge, you will appreciate, as you know, from the numbers you sometimes look at, that even our agricultural sector is largely funded from debt. We are in a debt levels now of about north of 168 billion rands. And money will continue to flow to the sector in as long as certain basic principles of economics apply. And I think that the lawmakers do understand that at this point.
So just going back to your point about places like Alexandra, and rightly where you mentioned that the spatial geography of South Africa has created real problems for us, because how do you social distance when you're living cheek by jowl and where reconstruction of the houses has not taken place and people aren't living with the dignity that certainly one would hope for, certainly I would hope for, if I'm proud of living in this country. The question, I suppose, is if we resolve, or at least begin to resolve the land problem, how will that help that sort of issue? Is that because some people will move out and start moving into agricultural areas, or is it because the peri-urban areas and the urban areas will look more like the South African demography than it does at present, or both?
Yeah, I think, Judge, one of the things we will need to always continuously emphasize is the fact that when we think about land reform, we need to think about it in two ways. We have had in South Africa a temptation of agriculturalizing land reform. And some of the fault has been also on people on my side. But I think now we have to look at it from the urban side as well as on the rural side. And on the urban side, that's where the issues of making sure that where there is some bit of a supply of land across the big metros, people can be able to be given some land parcels there so they can move away from some of the areas that they are largely concentrated on. And then we avail space somewhere where they can build themselves. And hopefully, if when we do that, we can also extend title deeds on those areas so that those who have means can really develop those areas into something that they really desire. And I know people like, for example, Bulelwa Mabasa, who's a workman's attorney, they've been thinking a lot about how to come up with instruments to assist in such areas like that.
Yeah, I suppose so. The question is then, just the final question for you is, why is it that we've taken so long to do this?
It's a difficult one to answer, Judge, because I mean, when I'm looking and thinking about land reform now, some of the questions that we have to grapple with this year, except that there's an addition of expropriation, but other than that, many of the questions are the ones that I was struggling with in my essays at university when I was studying on the land reform side. So that discussion hasn't changed much. And I hope that the low economic activity, the poverty that is rising, and the unemployment will really force us to seriously do land reform in a right way, and also other structural adjustments that Minister Mboweni or Governor Kganyago usually talk about when they talk about the macroeconomic side. We really need to get the things right out of this crisis to get South Africa going. Otherwise, we'll have big problems in the long run.
All I can say is from your mouth to God's ears. Thank you very much for discussing this with me. I mean, I think absolutely right. It is perhaps a central issue. And what worries me as I listen to you is we shouldn't lose this crisis. This should be a wake-up call for us to do that which we should have done a long time ago. Wandile, thank you so much for participating. And I hope everybody else enjoyed this. Everybody should stay safe. Bye-bye.